Welcome to a virtual tour of George Washington's historic Fort Loudoun in Winchester, Virginia, brought to you by the French and Indian War Foundation. The year is 1756. A young Colonel George Washington has decided that a substantial fort is necessary for him to protect the colonial interests against invasion by the French and their Indian allies. He writes a letter to the Honorable Robert Dinwiddie, Governor of Virginia, Winchester, 27 April, 1756.
Honorable Sir, we have the greatest reason in life to believe that the number of the enemy is very considerable, as they are spread all over this part of the country. If such another torrent as this has been should press upon our settlements, there will not be a living creature left in Frederick County. The inhabitants of the county who are now in forts are greatly distressed for want of ammunition and provision, and are incessantly importuning me for both, neither of which have I at this place to spare. To hear the cries of the hungry who have fled for refuge to these places, with nothing more than they carried on their backs, is exceedingly moving. I have wrote to the Assembly, setting forth the great and absolute necessity there is of erecting a large and strong fort at this place, to serve as a receptacle for all our stores, etc., and a place of refuge for the women and children in times of danger. This is the place generally fixed upon, as it has a free and open communication with all the country from its central situation. It is also conveniently situated for procuring the earliest intelligence when the enemy is about, and to obtain relief from the militia below. It is absolutely necessary to have one large magazine to supply the different forts with stores. There should also be ammunition lodged here for supplying the country people when found useful. Offering my opinion and counsel upon matters which regard the public safety and interest, your humble servant, George Washington.
A 5-acre tract of land located on the northern side of Winchester is selected so that the fort would be close enough for the citizens of this town to have refuge should they be attacked. The elevation of the site is about 40 feet above the town, making it ideal as the high ground. Washington prepared 2 plans for the fort in which he outlined a fortification with bastions at each of its 4 corners, measuring 204 feet between the tips of the bastions. A parade ground was centered on the crown of the hill. The fort was aligned a few degrees east of a north-south axis. The fort was designed to accommodate 450 soldiers and storage for weapons, munitions, and other supplies needed by the soldiers protecting the frontier. The fort was laid out on grounds of the site by George Washington according to the second plan. The gateway into the fort was on the south, facing the town of Winchester. Stone masons were selected from the regiment to build stone foundations upon which hewn logs for the walls of the fort would be placed horizontally. Over 100 men, skilled in carpentry, were gathered to place the logs in position in order to construct inner and outer walls forming the ramparts, bastions, and buildings. These inner and outer walls of logs forming the ramparts and bastions were 18 feet apart. The space between the walls was filled with dirt, stone, and debris as the work progressed. The final height of the walls was about 16 feet. The walls were then topped by a parapet over 6 feet wide and a banquet, or walkway, over 3 feet wide. Inside the fort, Washington laid out 5 major buildings, each of which abutted the inside walls of the fort. On the inside of the south rampart were 2 buildings, one on each side of the entryway. Each had a door facing the entryway. The building on the east side of the gate was identified as an officer's guardhouse and kitchen. This became George Washington's office at Fort Loudoun, where he would write many of his letters to the colonial governors and other military leaders. On July 15, 1757, Washington writes to Colonel Stanwix.
Dear Sir, your obliging favor of the 11th instant I received this morning. Militia, you will find, sir, will never answer your expectation. No dependence is to be placed upon them. They are obstinate and perverse. They are often egged on by the officers who lead them to acts of disobedience, and when they are ordered to certain posts for the security of the stores or the protection of the inhabitants, will resolve to leave them, and the united vigilance of their officers cannot prevent them. Out of 400 that were received at Fredericksburg and at this place, 114 have deserted. I have used the most vigorous measures to apprehend those fellows who escaped from hence, which amounted to about 30, and have succeeded so well that they are taken, with the loss of one of their men and a soldier wounded. I am determined, if I can be justified in the proceeding, to hang 2 or 3 as an example to others. George Washington.
The building on the west side of the entryway contained 2 rooms, a soldier's guard room and a prison to house any offending soldiers and captured enemies. Washington writes a letter to Colonel Stanwix from Fort Loudoun, June 15, 1757.
Sir, I have the pleasure to inform you that a scouting party under Lieutenant Baker returned with 5 scalps and a French officer prisoner. The name of the officer is Belest. This officer likewise says that the garrison at Fort Duquesne consists of 600 French and 200 Indians. Captain Spotswood, with 10 soldiers and 20 Indians, who went out at the same time with Lieutenant Baker, is not yet come in, which makes me uneasy. Duty and inclination equally induce me to communicate all remarkable occurrences to you. I have only to add that I am, with very great respect, your most obedient, humble servant, George Washington.
Opposite the buildings on the inner wall of the north side of the fort was a 2-story officers' barracks, about 18 feet wide by 85 feet long, with 20 small rooms on each floor, which served as rooms for officers. This barracks ran east-west and would have overlapped an area that is now covered by the south part of the house located at 419 North Loudoun Street. Buildings were constructed on the east and west walls that were 2 stories in height and about 18 feet wide by 68 feet long in size for use as barracks, storehouses, a hospital, or other purposes. Each of the bastions were covered over by logs and dirt, forming floors on top and storage magazines below. Charles Smith reported on the fort construction to Washington in a letter dated February the 23rd, 1758.
Sir, concerning the work at Fort Loudoun has gone on tolerable well in your absence. The 3rd barrack is entirely covered in, and the last one now a framing in order to raise. The parapet on the last curtain is up, the last bastion is laid over with logs, and 2 of the embrasures done, and now is about the other 4. We have done all the joiner's work in the 2nd barrack. We are in great want of a barrel of double tins for the last barrack, we not having one. Our stonemasons have been sick ever since you have been away, and our stonework is much behindhand.
The parade ground was the central part of the fort, where troops would muster, and it's likely that the British colonial red ensign flag would be flown. The colors would be raised in a ceremony every morning and lowered in the evening. Orders were given to the assembled troops in company formation by the commander of the fort or by the officer of the day. Companies would receive orders such as going on forage parties, dispatches to other forts on the frontier, and marches in formation on campaigns. Company drills were also conducted in the parade ground, as well as punishments for soldiers convicted in military courts-martial.
Evening orders. The troops will not march tomorrow, but it is expected all officers, etc., will be ready to march the next day, as Colonel Washington will not postpone the march any longer. 1 captain, 2 subalterns or 2nd lieutenants, and 60 rank and file to parade tomorrow morning at gun firing. The captain to wait on Colonel Washington as retreat beating for orders. None of the men that are to march on Wednesday are to be put on duty.
On the north end of the west barracks was a well, which was intended to provide water to the fort. A Dutch miner named Johann Christoph Heinz was recruited by George Washington and worked on digging the well for 2 years. Heinz needed to drill holes in the limestone bedrock, fill them up with black powder, then ignite and blast the rock, shattering it into rubble. He would then remove the rubble and repeat the process until a spring was struck. After 2 years of blasting and digging, they still had not found fresh water, although the shaft did fill up with seepage water from the limestone and runoff water from the surface where it rained. Charles Smith writes to Washington.
Sir, the well has been almost full of water, but now is cleared, and they are at work in it again. We have got the well 103 feet deep. I can't say that there is any likelihood of any spring. I am your friend and most obedient, humble servant, Charles Smith.
The powder magazine was located in the southeast bastion in the vicinity of the houses identified now as 414, 412, and 410 North Loudoun Street. Washington writes to Governor Dinwiddie,
It is absolutely necessary to have one large magazine to supply the different forts with stores. There should also be ammunition lodged here for supplying the country people when found useful, offering my opinion and counsel upon matters which regard the public safety and interest. Your humble servant, George Washington.
Fort Loudoun never realized its full potential as Washington had envisioned it. The work to finish construction was plagued by lack of funding. The well was effectively dry of fresh water, and the South Bastion stonework was collapsing by the first week of September 1758. By December, it was learned that Washington was going to resign his commission and return to Mount Vernon. Fort Loudoun would remain a military base during Dunmore's War and the Revolutionary War as a rendezvous point, and would later become a prison camp housing the British captured at the Battle of Saratoga. Over time, the walls of the fort would be dismantled by the local townsfolk to use in the building of houses. The well, however, remains to this day. For more information on George Washington's historic Fort Loudoun, visit www.fiwf.org.